Suddenly, some black ghost-like creatures along with the possessed students started to surround Vivien. Vivien knew that there was no time to hesitate. So she instantly rushed towards the enemies as she thought how she had to end that before they did anything weird. Vivien then, with a cold look in her eyes, charged at them, clenching her fist tightly. Vivien instantly reached the black ghost-like creatures and decided to destroy them with her punch. Vivien then channeled all the strength in her veins and punched the black ghost-like creature with all her might. But to her surprise, the black ghost-like creature spread its body towards the direction Vivien was in, which left Vivien puzzled for a moment. It was not over, as it looked like the black ghost-like creature had transformed its body and instantly surrounded Vivien like a gush of wind. Then all the small black ghost-like creatures merged into one big black ghost-like creatures, which gave a creepy smile as it asked Vivien what she was hiding. Vivien then, with a look of bewilderment, exclaimed as she tried to comprehend what just happened, but the huge creature continued pointing out that either way, she would be thrown out. Then, as the black ghost-like creature's eye glowed bright, it proceeded to state that after all, it was Vivien's fate to be thrown away again, and that she was trying to cling on to life, which to him was very unsightly. Vivien could not control her emotions anymore as tears welled up in her eyes. She exclaimed no. But then the black ghost-like creature, turning Vivien into a child, questioned her if she trusted a stranger when even her own mother threw her away, while Vivien just stood in utter shock trying to understand what just happened. Suddenly Vivien heard the voice of her father, which said, "I was hoping for a son." Then her mother's voice started to echo all around Vivien, which said, "I wish I had never given birth to you." Vivien, who had not transformed into small child, had chains binding her hands as she tried to cover her ears. But it was to no avail, as the voices continued saying how her very existence was a misfortune, moreover that everyone around her will die because of her. Furthermore, as the huge black ghost-like creature stared at Vivien intensely, the voices echoed as it questioned her why she didn't just quietly die off alone, which made Vivien wonder if she disappeared. Then the possessed students and monsters surrounded Vivien, who was holding the sword close to her own neck. Vivien then questioned if Mr. Fairy would be safe, to which the creature said that he promised. Then, listening to the word promise, Vivien, who had lost her will to fight, suddenly questioned herself about the word promise. Instantly, Vivien started to reminisce about her time with Andreas and the promise that they made. Then she remembered how Andreas had asked her to please keep the promise. Furthermore, Vivien remembered the moment Andreas told her that he would always be looking out for her. Abruptly, Vivien came back to her senses as she opened her eyes wide open in surprise, trying to comprehend what he was about to do. At the same time in the battle Andreas was in, Timer was killing hordes of undead in just one swing of his fists, and alongside him was Nickel, who was also ruthlessly destroying the undead army of Karen. Between them was Andreas, who was also dodging and attacking the hordes of undead without a moment's rest. Suddenly, the red crystal in Karen's hand started to emit strange crimson light, which covered Karen as he had launched the power of the crystal, and was excited to see how far Andreas can go with just the three of them. Then Karen, with a cunning evil smile, yelled, "Take this," as the awakened beast stood behind him, preparing to launch a huge blast with devastating power towards Andreas. But Andreas instantly sensed Karen's attack directed towards him and glanced at them in annoyance. Andreas then, without hesitating, used his summoning magic to call upon his other loyal subordinate. Suddenly, a portal opened above the awakened creature's head, from which a huge fist came rushing down on the awakened creature and stopping it before it could attack Andreas. This also left Karen bewildered and shocked. He could not believe what just happened and was left dumbfounded as he turned towards the portal Andreas summoned. Karen then began to stare at the portal and the huge fist that came flying from the portal as he questioned himself what that was. At the same time, Andreas and Timer were running as they dodged all the approaching enemies. Then Andreas called for Timer, who was beside him. Andreas then, looking at the huge monster running towards him, told Timer that he would leave that big one to him. In response, Timer just made a scary face and growled at the monsters who were rushing towards Andreas. Andreas then, glancing towards Nickel, called him and told him to clear out the mooks and get into hiding. Andreas then, looking around a battlefield, he saw how Timer was beating the huge monster aggressively and decided that he was going to take Karen down now. Then Andreas tried to calm himself down as he exhaled and started to wonder how, rather than spending his mana on mana-inefficient Rudos, instantly maintaining a fighting stance, Andreas thought how he was going straight for Sharon and would steal his Peldarine crystal. Immediately, as Timer wrestled the huge monster, Andreas jumped over them as he thought how he had to finish that fight before anyone noticed. At the same time, the awakened beast who had just been hit by the giant had fully recovered as it roared, to which Karen, looking at the awakened beast in excitement, started to laugh and exclaimed no way he could lose to such an attack. But suddenly Karen was surprised as he sensed someone approaching him. It was none other than Andreas, who had leaped over Timer and rushed towards him. Andreas then, without a moment's rest, launched a swing towards Karen, trying to kill him as soon as possible. As the attack reached Karen, a huge dust of explosion spread in the area where the attack had landed, which also left Karen dumbfounded as he witnessed Andreas's relentless assault. The attack Andreas launched was deflected by the hand of the awakened creature that shielded Karen and protected him. Karen then began his evil laugh and asked Andreas if he really thought that he was a match for an ancient magical beast. Meanwhile, Andreas was contemplating how using the deadly sins there might make it easier, but was confused as greed had its backlash and sloth was still in its cool-down period. Andreas, then maintaining his fighting stance, claimed that it seemed Karen like antiques. Further, Andreas pointed out that if it was an ancient magical beast, he also had one. Andreas then asked Karen if he remembered that big arm from earlier. Listening to Andreas made Karen recall that moment and question himself if it could have been a giant, furthermore wondering where he got something like that from. Andreas then, with a cold look, told Karen that next time he would have it crush his head, while he wondered in the back of his mind how he got to taunt Karen as much as he could. In response, Karen, with a cunning smile, told Andreas to try it. Furthermore, sarcastically, he told him if he could. Abruptly, Andreas's attention was diverted as he sensed something beneath him and opened his eyes wide open in shock. It was a blood magic circle beneath his feet, which startled Andreas as he tried to comprehend what it could be. But simultaneously, the blood magic circle started to activate, making the blood rise. Instantly, the blood magic circle caused a huge explosion, which made the blood burst out from the circle, making a huge explosion that even reached the trees. Karen then began to rejoin in joy, assuming that his blood magic had worked as the drops of blood began to fall down from the explosion. But to Karen's surprise, above the blood explosion, Andreas was safe and was effortlessly floating in the sky as he glared at Karen from above, while all Karen could do was yell how. Andreas then swiftly landed on the ground while Karen and the awakened creature looked at Andreas in bewilderment. Andreas then, with a curious look, glanced at his hands and questioned if that was vampire's blood magic. Andreas then began reminiscing about the time when the vampire bit him and questioned himself if it could be because of that time. Then Andreas began to contemplate that this was why Sharon was probably studying Angela's blood. Sharon, who was standing ahead of his awakened creature, then asked Andreas how he survived that high-rank blood magic, to which Andreas just stood there in complete silence. Andreas then, glancing at Sharon, exclaimed who knows, and that it was maybe thanks to Angela Lucifer's gift. Furious with Andreas's statement, Sharon began clenching his teeth in anger and exclaimed, "Don't tell me," further questioning if it was him who let that vampire escape. In response, Andreas, with a cold look, stated it was his bad and that maybe he should have treated his pupil nicer. Sharon could not control his anger anymore as veins started to pop from his head when he began yelling at Andreas. Immediately, Andreas, with a calm look, felt as if an attack was coming from Sharon and decided he needed to dodge it. Andreas then jumped in the air and avoided damage as an attack landed where Andreas was just standing. But it was not the end, as Sharon ran towards Andreas, yelling how dare he ruin his once-in-a-lifetime chance. Then the awakened creature began its assault towards Andreas, who, carefully analyzing the awakened creature, dodged all of its attacks. Then, as Andreas looked around a battlefield, all he could see was Timer, who kept attacking the monster. So he thought how it looked like Nickel had managed to hide. Sensing the moment to be right, Andreas then, without any hesitation, sent a slash of his swords towards Sharon. Sharon, who was terrified of Andreas's strength, looked like he was going to launch his attack, while Andreas, calmly analyzing the battlefield, knew what he had to do. Andreas then channeled all his energy and began to send glowing slashes towards him. But it was still not enough, as the awakened creature immediately interrupted his attack by defending Sharon with his hands. Then Sharon, who kept clenching his teeth in anger, wondered how that brat Andreas was more skilled with a sword than he thought. At the same time, Andreas had sneaked behind Sharon and was ready to attack him. Andreas then held his sword firmly and decided that he had to end Karen's life at that instant. But suddenly the awakened creature again interfered with his plan as it used one of its arms to attack Andreas, which made Andreas's plan of killing Sharon fail. The single swing from the awakened creature was incredibly powerful as blood came out of Andreas's mouth. Andreas, after being hit by the awakened creature, was sent flying in the opposite direction. Abruptly, Sharon, who was standing ahead of his awakened beast, felt a sharp sensation in his right hand. It was a sword attack that cut the arm from which he was holding the magical crystal. The one who slashed Sharon's arm was none other than Nickel, who was hiding, patiently waiting for that opportunity where he could deliver a clean strike just like that. Sharon was in a state of utter shock as he could not comprehend what just happened and how they were able to cut him. Meanwhile, Andreas, who had already fallen down by the awakened attack, just gave a cunning laugh as he looked at Sharon. Sharon then began screaming in pain as his voice echoed through the village. Sharon looked like he was in immense pain. Sweat dripped from his face as he yelled, trying to bear the pain. Looking towards Sharon, Andreas grinned as he praised Nickel for a job well done as their sneak attack plan had been successful. Yelling in pain, he held his hand tightly, hoping to stop excessive blood loss as he closed his eyes, trying to endure the pain, while his severed hand and the crystal had fallen onto the ground. His eyes widened as sweat dripped from his face while he made a troubled face as he glanced towards the crystal that had fallen on the ground when his hand was dismembered. Abruptly, he was caught in a state of surprise as he glanced upwards holding his hand. It was none other than Kushane, who with his eyes glowing bright red looked up in the sky, opened its mouth and screeched in a loud high-pitched voice as it clenched its fist. With a troubled look on his face, he nervously glanced towards Kushane while sweat dripped from his face as he exclaimed crap and was telling how Kushane was going out of control, but soon disregarded his statement as he witnessed Sharon leaping towards the crystal while Kushane with its eyes glowing bright red was watching Sharon. Andreas thought to himself how without the crystal, Kushane would truly be out of control. As he was leaping towards the crystal, Sharon, with a troubled look on his face and nervousness in eyes, dripped sweat from his face as he started to question himself if he could really get the crystal. Suddenly, a loud crunch sound appeared behind his back. Andreas was left in a state of shock. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing as everything happened so suddenly out of the blue. His gaze widened as he nervously glanced towards what was happening. It was Sharon, whose upper body was flying mid-air as blood spattered everywhere, while more than half of his body was snapped by a single bite from Kushane. Soon, the lifeless body of Sharon fell on the ground. He lost his life in an instant. A single bite from a mythical creature like Kushane was enough to take his life with a single snap. However, Andreas, witnessing the current situation, was trying his best to grasp what was happening and what he should do. Abruptly, Kushane stopped glaring into the lifeless body of Sharon and soon glanced towards Andreas, staring at him with blood dripping from his mouth. Instantly, Andreas looked at Nickel and requested him to grab its attention as they have got to recover the crystal that was used to tame Kushane. To their surprise, Kushane took the crystal and smashed it, clenching its fist as small chunks of crystal started to fly everywhere. Kushane was so strong that the chunks of crystal started to turn into dust as it started to fall from its hand. Andreas exclaimed, "Shit," as things had gone out of control, and both him and Nickel maintained their fighting stance. Timer, who was surrounded by the undeads, nervously growled as he witnessed Kushane breaking the crystal that was supposed to help tame a mythical creature like him. Suddenly, Kushane concentrated mana on his mouth and was going to launch an attack while Timer and Andreas were just in front of him, and Andreas exclaimed how it was not going well. Instantly, Kushane opened his mouth wide open as he screeched in a high-pitched voice and quickly launched the attack upon them. As the attack got closer to them, Andreas turned back and ordered everyone to dodge as it was not something that they could defend against. The attack was so huge that a huge explosion was caused by it as rocks started to fly everywhere, and Kushane was just standing there watching the impact of his attack. The attack was so big that the impacts alone could harm a normal human being. Meanwhile, Andreas was using his sword as a shield to save himself from the impact. Suddenly, he was grabbed by one of Kushane's hands. He was left in a state of surprise as he couldn't comprehend how fast Kushane was and the strength he had, so being able to free from Kushane's captivity wouldn't be so easy. Kushane was continuously holding Andreas, tightening his grip as he raised Andreas midair. The grip was so tight that Andreas was in a lot of pain and couldn't bear it since Kushane's strength was incomparable, him being a gigantic, mythical creature. Timer and Nickel had a displeased look on their faces as their master was being hurt and toyed around like a toy by Kushane. Their eyes were filled with rage as they couldn't bear it any longer and decided to launch an attack with the hope to save their master. But to their surprise, Kushane, holding Andreas with one hand, swung another hand towards Timer and Nickel as they flew backwards after taking the attack. Kushane's grip was so strong that Andreas was feeling immense pain as the grip was taking a toll on his body and bones. But to his surprise, Vivien came to help him as she swiftly cut the hand that was tightly holding onto Andreas. As he got freed from Kushane's tight grip, he opened his eyes and was shocked to see it was none other than Vivien, who had come to save her in such a dire time. Andreas started to fall as he was free from Kushane's grip, whose hand was cut off by Vivien. Meanwhile, Vivien rushed towards him yelling, "Andreas!" Vivien leaped towards Andreas with the hope of grabbing onto him before he fell on the ground. She was getting closer to him and was just about to hold on to him, but abruptly, Andreas, with a troubled look on his face, yelled, "No," telling Vivien to watch out because it was Kushane who was standing behind Vivien, angry that he had just lost one of his limb to Vivien, who had launched a surprise sneak attack on him. Instantly, Kushane, with his eyes glowing bright red, launched yet another attack on Vivien that struck her as she couldn't evade his swift attack. The attack was so strong that Vivien was tossed several times on the ground and landed on a huge rock that laid there. Meanwhile, Andreas had successfully landed but yelled Vivien, looking at the back because Vivien, who had come to save him, was counterattacked by Kushane. To his surprise, Timer had successfully saved Vivien as he hugged her and had taken most of the impact from Kushane's devious blow. If it wasn't for Timer, Vivien would be badly hurt by Kushane. Seeing Vivien sleep peacefully in Timer's arm and not got hurt relieved Andreas as he silently glanced towards her and was thankful towards Timer for saving her life. After making sure that Vivien and Timer were fine, Andreas turned his gaze towards Kushane, who was growling and seemed upset as he had just lost one of his hands. Andreas had a troubled look on his face as a mythical creature like Kushane was taking a toll on him, but quickly disregarded his thoughts, claiming there was no time to be worrying, and opened a portal out of which an undead with a crown on its hand passed it towards Andreas, who in the back on his mind was wishing he could do a bit more research before he used it, and quickly wore the crown as he gazed towards Kushane with a displeased look on his eyes, with murderous intent in his eyes because it was kill or be killed moment. Suddenly, a system window popped before him stating the original sin greed has been detected, further asking if he would like to use greed. Thinking how it was better than ending up dead there, he quickly concluded that he should use it and accepted the notification. Meanwhile, Vivien had started to gain her consciousness. As she started to slowly open her eyes up, she was left in a state of shock as to what she was witnessing before her. It was Kushane who was gathering mana on his mouth to launch yet another fierce supernova attack, while Andreas was standing before him as blue thunderous mana started to emit from his body as he got ready to take on a mythical creature like Kushane. She couldn't believe at what she was witnessing. Seeing Andreas in such a state, she might have never thought of such a situation, and trying to comprehend the situation, she whispered, addressing Mr. Fairy. Andreas looked nothing like his normal self. A soft and calm person like Andreas, but to see him in such a condition with his eyes glowing bloody red and a devilish murderous intense smile on his face as he was about to take head-on with Kushane. Abruptly, Kushane launched a supernova attack from his mouth towards Andreas, who was standing in front of him in a calm situation, not overwhelmed by Kushane. With eyes glowing bright red, Andreas grinned and laughed as he easily cut off the attack sent by Kushane, addressing it as filthy ancient beast, and quickly sprinted towards Kushane, shouting he would turn him into an undead and make him his slave. Andreas had truly become a different person. He continued laughing and mocking at Kushane and instantly launched a sword attack on Kushane, which he easily blocked using his hand. The hard iron-like armor of Kushane and Andreas' sword made such a huge impact when they clashed that flashes appeared. But that was not all, as Kushane launched yet another blow, which Andreas blocked using his sword, leaving him confused as to how Kushane not only blocked the attack but countered with yet another blow that left Andreas flying, but he stood his ground, taking the impact. Kushane's force was so immense that Andreas was sent flying with a gush of smoke and rocks flying around him. Now, Andreas was starting to get the hang of it. He saw everything now. Looking towards Kushane, he thought about how he was using an absolute defense that only reacts against perceived attacks. Reminiscing about the time when Vivien sneaked and cut off one of his hands, his eyes started to sparkle as he grinned, concluding how surprise attacks would work on him. Realizing what needed to be done in order to defeat Kushane, Andreas smiled as he addressed Nickel and ordered him to play the bait, while Nickel, without thinking it twice, agreed to it and swiftly jumped, vanishing in the open air with the goal to play as a bait and divert Kushane. Nickel, who was an aura master, started to show his true potential as he launched several swift attacks on Kushane, who, trying to grasp Nickel's speed, was not being able to dodge them and was taking hits continuously, while Andreas was looking for a brief moment to counterattack. Meanwhile, Vivien, who was wrapped around Timer's hand, was watching Nickel, who was fighting fiercely. He had her undivided attention as she rigorously watched his swordsmanship and questioned if that was really an undead. Vivien then looked up towards Timer and further questioned him, addressing him as Mr. Cat, which made Timer startle for a moment and then followed up with a low growl. As Nickel launched multiple swift attacks on Kushane, who had his hands full as he couldn't dodge properly and counterattack Nickel's attack. Meanwhile, Andreas successfully managed to sneak behind Kushane and praised Nickel, exclaiming, "Good," and grinned as his eyes started to sparkle with murderous intent and got into position as he pulled back his sword and quickly thrashed his sword, piercing at the back of the Kushane. Since this was a surprise attack, Kushane couldn't harden his armor, thus taking a blow from Andreas. Kushane screeched and yelled in pain as he raised his hands, arching his back due to Andreas, who was still trying his best to pierce through Kushane's back with his sword. Meanwhile, Nickel was in his fighting stance, ready to defend Andreas in case of counterattack. Seeing how he had successfully managed to take a toll on Kushane, he smiled as he stated how he would turn Kushane into an undead, but was soon caught in a state of surprise as he witnessed a system notification that popped before him. It was about the sealed sword Galaxer, which had detected an ancient magical beast's blood, and was now absorbing the magical beast Kushane's blood. Abruptly, the Galaxer started to emit crimson mana from it as it started to absorb Kushane's blood, whose veins had started to pop out of everywhere, while Andreas, trying to comprehend the situation, asked himself what was happening. Simultaneously, another notification popped up stating the greed active duration was ending with a backlash. His eyes widened as it started to turn even more blood red, with blood spattering from his mouth as he was caught in a state of surprise as to how the greed duration was ending, and that too with a backlash. Vivien, who was witnessing everything, couldn't see Andreas in such a state, and her eyes sparkled as she yelled Andreas, who was falling down as he gazed towards Kushane, who was crying with pain with Andreas's sword pierced at his back. The Galaxer also seemed to take effect, as the body part around which he was pierced was emitting fiery mana. As Andreas fell down on the floor, Timer and Vivien hurriedly rushed towards him, while Vivien held one of her hands that was hurt in the fight with Kushane, who was screeching with pain as the mana emitted from the Galaxer started to get even bigger and brighter, turning into thunderstorms made of aura, while Vivien was running towards Andreas, who was down on the floor. The screeching voice of Kushane started to lower as he slowly started to vanish, and was on the verge of dying, while Vivien held Andreas on his arms, who was badly hurt after the backlash, was struggling as he opened one of his eyes while they both gazed towards Kushane, who was vanishing. Suddenly, a notification window popped up stating the ancient beast's blood had released the Galaxer's first seal. Looking at Kushane, who was about to completely vanish, Andreas wondered how he never thought the blood of an ancient magical beast would be the key to unsealing Galaxer. While everyone was watching Kushane, Vivien asked Andreas if it was over. Vivien gazed towards Andreas while Andreas, with a serious look on his face, coughed and apologized to Vivien for putting her in danger. Vivien quickly smiled and told it was okay, as long as Andreas was safe, to which Andreas again apologized to Vivien for hiding his real identity. Vivien replied saying she didn't mind no matter who he was because it doesn't change the fact that he was her Mr. Fairy. Meanwhile, Timer and Nickel stood besides watching everything, while Galaxer started to darken as the first seal was released. Closing his eyes, Andreas blushed as he wondered if there ever was a time that someone put their complete trust in him like that. After a few days, it had come to the days when the 111th opening ceremony of the Rodlin Academy was held. As the spokesperson announced the beginning of the ceremony, he called upon Mr. Luis Artman, the first in his class, requesting him to please come to the podium. He continued saying how Mr. Luis Artman demonstrated academic excellence and good conduct. The students were excited, and Lucia, with a smile on her face, was trying to communicate with Andreas, who with a serious look on his face was with his own chain of thoughts, thinking how this was where the game really started, and so far he had somehow managed to survive despite his lack of information. Although the number of people he had to protect had increased, at the same time, it also gave him strength, and glanced at Vivien, giving a grim smile. Reminiscing the villains he had yet to face, he thought how from here on, many big events would be coming, but he was sure that he would face them all. This war for the deadly sins. Meanwhile, as the event was going on, Mr. Luis Artman, the top in his class, stepped up to the podium to take a word of oath in front of everyone. Then Luis, with a determined look, had a small note in his hands, started his oath as he swore that he and all the new students of the 111th class swore to stand shoulder to shoulder with their seniors at the proud Rodlin Academy. While Andreas and everyone who were there listened to Luis attentively, Luis continued his oath as he exclaimed to strive and to be the spear that protected the Empire and its people, and to be heroes who would bring glory to the Empire. He then ended his oath as exclaimed that he was Luis Artman, the first-year representative. As he finished his oath, Luis, in a calm manner, slowly made his way from the podium down the stairs while everyone was still looking at him for being an exceptional newcomer. While he was making his way back to the stands, he had a sudden change in expression as he got a glimpse of the other students, who were all giving him a cold look. Watching those students, Luis wondered if those guys over there were his seniors, as all of them looked strong compared to him and his friends. Suddenly, he looked above and caught the attention of Andreas, who was calmly standing in the middle of Lucia and Vivien. Looking at Andreas carefully, Luis wondered if the mantle Andreas was wearing was from the magic facility, so he questioned why a mage was carrying a sword with him, which brought a smirk on his face, wondering how interesting Rodlin Academy and the students here were. Meanwhile, at the Rodlin Academy's spring tournament, a couple of first-year students were having a conversation about a random match regardless of faculty, which didn't sound that interesting to them. While Luis was walking behind them, one of the first-year students told the other not to be excited just because we didn't have classes because they were first-year students, but the next year, it will be their turn, to which the other student exclaimed that because they were first-year students, they could watch it without worrying about anything at the moment. As he listened to what the other first-year students had to say, Luis thought to himself how watching these matches would be a good thing, because they would get to see all kinds of skills and techniques, and not top of that, the magic faculty was also joining in. But as he was wondering all this, he unintentionally barged into someone who was carrying a drink with him. The student had an angry look on his face as his drink had spilled all over his clothes as he called Luis a bastard, to which Luis, who was terrified, apologized to the student and told him that he wasn't paying attention. Out of nowhere, the student raised his hand to throw a vicious punch at Luis, but Luis, being a top first-year student, was quick to react to the punch as he swiftly raised both his hand and tried his best to block the attack. But the punch was so powerful that Luis could not stand his ground as he came flying back to where Diane was sitting, spilling the cup of tea which she was having with her friends. The other student had a confused look on his face as he exclaimed how blocking the top of the night faculty's punch was not a small thing to do, further acknowledging Luis that the others weren't lying about him being the first year's top student. Meanwhile, Luis had a stern look on his face as he slowly started to get up from the fall, while Lucia was also there in the room looking at Luis in a terrified way. Luis, who had a puzzled look, wondered how the punch wasn't that fast, but it was so heavy that they couldn't stop it completely. As Luis stood up from the punch, the other student told him that he will let Luis off the hook if he gave him 100,000 wills. While Vivien was also with the girls, calmly having her tea, Lucia abruptly got up and yelled how asking for 100,000 wills was outright extortion. She further told him to have a shred of dignity, as he was not a beggar. Suddenly, with a stern look on her face, she broke her silence as she called his name, Senior Todd, telling him how it sounded like he was happy to be disqualified just to cause a fuss in the street. Both Todd and Luis gave a quick glance back at Diane, who further told Tolden that by using his logic, he should be the one paying her 100,000 wills. Listening to this, Tolden had a terrified look on his face as he did not realize Diane Alvin was also in the room. Diane gave a stern look back to Todd as she raised her hand to show that he was responsible for the tea that spilled over her clothes. Suddenly, Tolden realized he shouldn't be messing with someone like Diane, so he told Luis that he was just lucky this time around. As Tolden walked away from them, Diane and Lucia were still giving a stern look at Tolden for being such a disrespectful guy. Meanwhile, Luis realized how grateful he was for having Lucia and Diane by his side, so he told him how thankful he was to them for saving him from Todd, to which Diane told him not to worry about anything, while Lucia, with a look of excitement, asked Luis if he was the first-year representative. Luis then replied that he was the first-year representative, and that his name was Luis Artman. Diane then told him that she was a fourth-year student. Then Lucia gave her introduction as she told him she was a second-year student, and that it was really unlucky of Luis to get into trouble so early in the school year. Suddenly, Vivien, who was staying silent, broke her silence as she quickly got up and told him that she was going now, which left Luis in a confused state. With a glow on her face, she told him that Andreas's match was about to start, so she should start making her way there. Hearing this brought a smile on Luis's face as he told her it was really nice for him to meet a senior from the night faculty. As Lucia and Diane were witnessing the conversation attentively, Luis raised his hand in front of Vivien to get a handshake from her, but she did not give any reaction at all. While Luis was still raising his hand, Vivien gave him a cold look. But abruptly, Lucia tried to make it less awkward by calling Vivien a bit peculiar and invited Luis to join them if he really wanted to watch the match as well. Then Diane, who didn't expect Lucia to watch the fight, told her she didn't think Lucia would be interested in these kind of things as well. To which replied that sometimes even she gets excited about these fights too. But abruptly, Diane asked Lucia if she was not going to participate in it as well, which brought a sudden change in her expression as she, in an embarrassed way, told her that she was not going to participate. Then Diane told Luis that they were about to go to the tournament soon and asked Luis what he wanted to do, to which Luis replied that he was about to go and see the tournament himself. Then, Diane with excitement in her eyes told Luis that they should go to the tournament together, to which Luis agreed happily. Soon, they reached the place where the tournament was being held, where a huge number of students were gathered. Luis and all of the girls were watching the fights take place attentively. Luis, with a look of bewilderment, exclaimed how the match that took place just now was amazing, and he expected this from Rodlin as this school was on a whole other level. Then, the announcer of the tournament announced that the competitors for the next match are coming to the platform now. Hearing this made Luis excited as he stated that it seemed the next match was starting already, but Vivien still had a cold look on her face as usual. Then, the announcer stated that the first competitor in the blue corner was the top of night faculty, Todd, and as the top student in the night faculty, they expected great things from him in this year's competition. And the announcer further stated that the competitor in the red corner who will fight against him was magic faculty fourth-year student, Andreas Cromwell. While Luis was watching Andreas into the platform, Vivien finally could witness Andreas fight in the tournament. Meanwhile, Andreas had a cold look on his face as the announcers further stated that Andreas had attracted a lot of attention for his invention of a new potion. Then Luis remembered the time he saw Andreas first time as he wondered if he was the guy he saw at the entrance ceremony, and he questioned if Andreas was actually going to fight the top of the night faculty in a sword fight. While the announcer stated that the match was about to begin shortly, Todd quickly grabbed his sword and sternly asked Andreas if he was the one from the magic faculty pretending to be a swordsman. To which Andreas in a cold manner replied that he wasn't pretending, but if he thought so, that was on him. Listening to Andreas brought a terrifying look on his face as he called Andreas a cocky bastard, while the announcer stated that the fight had finally begun. Without wasting any time, Todd quickly took out his sword and approached Andreas in a vicious manner, yelling that he will teach Andreas the true weight of the sword. As he launched his first move, his announcer commented how right off the bat, Todd took off with a ferocious assault. In the meantime, Lucia glanced at Diane and asked her if she knew about that, to which Diane, who didn't know what Lucia was talking about, replied, "About what?" While everyone witnessing the tournament were excited with what they were watching, Lucia told Diane that she heard there would be an exchange meeting with the Mythical Academy after the tournament, to which Diane finally grasped what Lucia was talking about. Diane then stated that they said that those with outstanding academic results should go if possible, but anyhow, she will be forced to go anyway. Suddenly, she reminisced about the time her father told her if she joined, the Alvins will be able to show Milko the difference between them and the Alvins even more clearly, so she should just go. Listening to this made Lucia a bit uncomfortable as she stated how only imagining about this sounds like a pain to her. While Andreas and Todd were still in the middle of an intense fight, Diane further stated that she had heard that if the students placed high enough in this tournament, they would be able to join as well. Then Diane gave a glance at Vivien and stated that she would be able to join her as well. Diane remembered the fight Vivien had and further stated that after beating Senior Aaron, who was yesterday's favorite, there was a good chance Vivien would be able to join. Meanwhile, Todd was swinging his sword fiercely at Andreas, calling him a bastard and yelling at him to stop dodging and fight him. Then Todd, holding his sword in a horizontal way, told him how he never thought he would have to use his technique on someone like Andreas. But Andreas did not say anything back and was just giving him a cold look and swiftly dodging his attacks without countering them. Suddenly, Todd fiercely launched another attack with his sword, but Andreas was again quick to react as he swiftly moved towards his left to dodge the attack effectively. As Andreas quickly glanced back at Todd, but this time Todd was not where he should have been. Out of the blue, he appeared right behind Andreas, preparing to launch a vicious blow at Andreas, but it seemed like Andreas was aware of the attack. While Andreas was being attacked by Todd from all sides at a very quick pace, the commentator stated that this was a fearsome onslaught from Todd and Andreas Cromwell was in real danger. In the meantime, Luis, who was still surprised witnessing the swift moves from Andreas, acknowledged him for the way he carried himself, and he also remembered witnessing it before, while Vivien had a smile on her face watching Andreas fight. She then broke her silence as she exclaimed that this was Mr. Fairy's win, but listening to Vivien speak brought a surprised look on Luis's face. Meanwhile, Todd, who was ready to launch another attack, made fun of Andreas, asking him if his sword was just for decoration, and sternly told him to show him the magic Andreas was so proud of. Then, Andreas swiftly dodged his attack and told him that this was going to be the end of the fight. Everyone who was witnessing the fight were in a state of bewilderment as they watched how Andreas dodged the attack, and there was also a loud sound which left everyone worried. This time Andreas not only dodged the attack but slammed Todd's head right to the ground, which was so powerful it broke some parts of the platform they were fighting on. The whole place was left in silence, as they witnessed Todd lying on the ground and Andreas on the other hand was standing tall in frund of him. Then, Andreas with a cold look on his face told him that there was no need to use a sword or magic on someone like him. The crowd were left astonished at what had just happened as some of them started to comment how unbelievable it was. For Todd Terry, the favorite to win was defeated by the fourth-year student of the magic faculty. Then as Andreas stood confidently on the destroyed battlefield, the host of the event yelled at everyone stating that the winner was none other than Andreas Cromwell, who with a confident stance was glancing at his defeated opponent unconscious in the ground. At the same time, Luis was left speechless with the power Andreas just displayed as he had defeated the top of the night faculty with his bare hands, making him curious as to who that guy was. Meanwhile, Vivien with a blushing look on her face exclaimed that was a Mr. Fairy, but Lucia could not believe what she saw and claimed no way as that just now was. Diane then proceeded to explain that a sorcerer used a knight's mana to invigorate his body, which left all three of them in a state of surprise. Meanwhile, the Tower Master, who was also observing the battle, exclaimed a duel cover her. Then with a calm look on his face, the Tower Master wondered how he hadn't thought that Andreas would use it there. Then as Andreas confidently walked down the stairs to leave the arena, the Tower thought how he no longer had to hide it, further claiming that it looked like a storm was brewing. As Andreas left the arena, the announcer started to explain that the last match of the day was over, and that the best of 16 matches will be held starting tomorrow, and requested everyone to check their tablets to find out the latest list of matchups. Then as Andreas was walking claiming, he heard a voice calling him senior and instantly recognized it to be Lucia, who was waving her hands. Then Lucia, who was with the whole group, gave Andreas a thumbs up, and then congratulating him, Lucia pointed out that he was amazing. Andreas then looking at the group questioned why everyone was there, while in the back of his mind he wondered what kind of group that was. In response, Diane told Andreas who knows and began explaining how it just sort of became like that. But that was not enough as it made Andreas confused as he wondered about what was being said. Then looking at Luis, Andreas questioned himself why Luis was even there, to which Luis gave an awkward smile. Luis then bowing his head introduced himself stating that his name was Luis Artman and that it was nice to meet him, to which Andreas just calmly told him that he was Andreas Cromwell. Andreas then began wondering how Luis was the first main character he played in Deadly Sins alive like that. It felt quite moving, and this made him a bit nervous too. Diane then looking towards Andreas told him that was quite a surprise. And by the way, she didn't know he could also use aura. Then looking closer to Andreas, Diane questioned if he had never learned to use a sword before, because he didn't know he had a special constitution. Then concluded that's why Andreas recently started training using a sword. Andreas then with a worried look on his face told Yes as that was about right, while in the back of his mind he thought how she had analyzed everything he did. Luis, who was standing there, was amazed at the state Ma Diane and began to ask Andreas how he moved like that when he had only been learning to use a sword for a short time. Meanwhile, Vivien looking at Lucia started to wonder since when was she beside Andreas. Luis then with an astonished look questioned Andreas if it could be that he had something like a special training method not taught at the academy. Meanwhile, Andreas wondered in the back of his mind how Luis sure came on strong, even though they had only just met. So Andreas guessed that the eagerness and excellent ability to learn were what drove his growth. Andreas then, with a smile on his face, told Luis that it was not much as he was just using aura to invigorate his body, and that was all he was doing. Which made Lucia look at Andreas with a puzzled look, while Andreas wondered, though, he still couldn't achieve instantaneous movement like Master did. Andreas then began reminiscing about his master, and thought how after Hosen left, the only apprentice D. Scrun took was him. And as for Luis, he only gave him a little training because he was interested in his talent. So he concluded that maybe that was why he still didn't know how to use the master's aura control method. Luis then looking at his hands tried to comprehend what Andreas just said and questioned about using aura to invigorate the body. Luis then asked if he didn't mind, could he show it to him once as it was hard for him to grasp it from words alone. Hearing this, Andreas started to wonder how he would like to teach him, but it was not something that could be done in a day or two, so perhaps next time he would teach him, and besides that he would grow up on his own anyway. Andreas then told Luis that he was busy with a match right now, and perhaps later, when he had some free time, to which Luis bowed his head in gratitude and told Andreas, "Thank you very much, senior." Andreas then, with a slight laugh, told Luis that his eagerness to learn is impressive, even though he had only just enrolled there. Meanwhile, Lucia spoke of which and asked Andreas if he wasn't a terrible senior, as they had spent over half a year together researching potions, and he didn't tell her about it, to which Andreas responded by stating that it was his bad and pointed out that back then he just didn't want to stand out. Hearing all this made Vivien shocked as she wondered about how they were together for half a year. Lucia then asked Andreas why he was doing things that stand out now. Andreas, then maintaining his composure, told her that he thought he would try joining the exchange meeting and explained that she knew that it was hard to rise to the top with magic alone, while in the back of his mind he wondered how the truth was that he was keeping it hidden because the playable characters might kill him if he stood out. Lucia then understood. Andreas told him that she could see that, since his talent for magic was non-existent. Andreas, embarrassed by her words, told her that lately he had been working on his fire magic, to which Lucia with a cunning look asked, "Oh, really?" and then told his good luck with that. Andreas then told Lucia thanks for the pep talk. Andreas then thought how the exchange meeting was an event he had never seen back in the game and decided that there was no need for him to go out of his way to join it, but there was someone at Mythical Academy that he would like to meet who was another playable character named Ketchlung Vialga. Vivien then, with a confident look, glanced at Andreas and told him that he would do his best to and join the exchange meeting with him, to which Lucia exclaimed, "Oh, my seniors sure are ambitious." Dane then exclaimed, "Well," and said if they were going to join, it can't be a bad thing to aim for the top, and then told everyone to let's check out the matchup list. Dane then opened her tablet and showed everyone the matchups, while Lucia, looking at the tablet, pointed out that assuming all of them keep winning, then Senior Vivien and Dane would face each other in the top 4, and whoever wins would face Senior Andreas in the finals. Dane then, with a determined look on her face, told that she was confident in herself. Vivien also joined in and told everyone that she won't lose either. Andreas then, with a smile on his face, also said that he would do his best too. Dane then closed the tablet and told everyone to let's do our best together then. Lucia then pointed out that they were 2 rookies who have emerged as favorites to win the championship, and one who was the original favorite to win the championship, and when they think about it, all the championship favorites are here, to which Luis gave a slight laugh and said that he had stumbled upon an amazing sight, asking if he hadn't. Then as they left, Lucia told Luis that it was for real, and that he should feel honored calling him a newcomer. Then 5 days later, on the day of the tournament final, the arena was filled with cheers from the crowd, and the host announced that the final of Rodlin Academy's 58th spring tournament was on and called both competitors to please enter the arena. As the finalists were walking towards the arena, the host explained how there were many upsets in this year's tournament, but the most spectacular of them was the person who made it to the finals. It was none other than the Magic Faculty 4th year's student Andreas Cromwell, who entered the arena with a determined look on his face. And facing him, the one who stopped Vivien Belrican, the other unexpected protagonist in her way to become a champion. Magic Faculty 4th year's student Diane Alvin, who was welcomed with cheers all around. Then the host explained how this was the first time in 12 years that there would be a champion from the Faculty of Magic. At the same time, Vivien, who was sitting with Lucia amongst a crowd of audience, calling Andreas Mr. Fairy, told him to do his best, while Lucia glanced at her wondering how she looked like a different person when she was fighting. Then as the crowd cheered them on, the host declared that with all the attention drawn by all the irregularities, it was time for the match to begin and called for both the competitors to get ready. Diane, then standing in front of Andreas, told him sorry as she was not handing over the championship title to Andreas. Andreas then, with a calm look, told Diane that she would have to go all out right from the start then. Then as the host announced the match to be on, Diane told Andreas as he wished then, and with a determined look began casting fireball spells in both her hands. Everyone watching this was left in a state of shock as they witnessed Diane's mighty powers. Diane then, casting multiple fireballs that were floating all around her, told Andreas that he would end that right away. Andreas, excited for the battle, instantly grabbed his sword and exclaimed, "All right, here he goes." Andreas then, without any hesitation, rushed towards Diane, who had multiple fireballs surrounding her, ready to launch them. Diane then, sensing Andreas's determination, decided that it was time for her to launch her fireballs at him and instantly launched them. But this was not enough as Andreas swiftly dodged all the fireball attacks and continued to rush towards her at an incredibly fast pace, holding his sword, which made Dean surprised as she conjured another fireball to attack him. Diane then immediately launched the fireball, aiming at Andreas, who had already reached very close to her. Andreas then, even though the fireball was attacked so closely, was able to dodge it by shifting his body to the other direction. Diane, looking at the fast reflexes of Andreas, was left in a state of bewilderment as she tried to comprehend how he was doing that. But suddenly Andreas rushed and sent a destructive slash towards the direction of Diane. But to his surprise, Diane just vanished from the place she was just in, which made his eyes wide open in shock. Then immediately, as a mysterious purple mana emerged Diane and appeared behind Andreas, which made Andreas realize how she could use spatial magic already. Andreas then, with a cunning smile, wondered how Diane was beyond his expectations. Meanwhile, Diane, who was behind Andreas, began to wonder what it was with his freakish speed, while Andreas, glancing towards Diane, told her more. Andreas then, with a confident look, turned towards Diane and told her to entertain him more. This statement left Diane in utter shock, as she could not have imagined that he would be enjoying the fight. Then, clenching her teeth in frustration, Diane wondered if he was saying that he was not afraid of her, and thought how that was so annoying. Diane, then determined to show Andreas what she was capable of, started channeling mana with her hands as he yelled at Andreas to not underestimate her. Meanwhile, Lucia, looking at Diane's power, exclaimed, "What incredible mana power," and claimed that senior Diane was well beyond the level of a student, asking Vivien if she was wrong, while Vivien wondered how Diane was strong. Diane, then concentrating on the spell, thought how she had never succeeded in using that move yet, but she felt like she could do it now. Instantly, the spell that Diane used made all the flames turn into flaming spears which were surrounding her. Andreas then kept rushing towards Diane while looking at her attack. He claimed that it was a flaming spear with an explosion effect, which was a great idea, but if it was dodged. But suddenly Andreas was startled as he sensed something above him. It was the same flaming spear, but this time Diane used her spatial magic to attack him from above. Simultaneously, a huge explosion occurred at the spot where Andreas was just a moment ago, which destroyed the ground and sent it scattering all around, while Diane just stood there trying to find Andreas. Diane then suddenly noticed something which caught her eye. It was Andreas, who had dodged the attack and was being pushed away by the explosion as he tried to slow down. Andreas, then trying to stand up, wondered if he hadn't protected his body with mana. That would have been really bad, as just using spatial magic was already difficult enough, but to think she combined it with attack magic with double chanting. Meanwhile, Diane was also surprised as he could withstand the fire spear that she teleported to him with just his physical strength, which made her question if he was even human. Then Diane surrounded Andreas with multiple spatial magic spells combined with a flaming sword, while Andreas wondered how Diane's speed of growth was exceeding his imagination. But Andreas had still not given up as the flaming spears approached him. Andreas thought how to see the growth of these playable characters was exciting. Immediately, as the crowd watched them intensely, a huge explosion could be seen that was caused by the flaming spears of Diane. And amongst the crowd was Lucia, who claimed that even if it was senior Andreas, being caught by that was. But as Lucia glanced at Vivien, she, along with Luis, was scared to see that killing intent Vivien was giving off as she focused on the match. Diane, then looking at the destruction caused by her attack, started to laugh as she claimed she did it. Then Diane, with a joyous look on her face, assumed that her attack had worked and began to say that it was her. But Diane was abruptly interrupted as Andreas sent a devastating slash towards her that sliced the ground, leaving her with no option but to dodge. Diane, then looking at the ground being cut in half, was shocked as the arena that her dad personally fixed and reinforced because it was broken down 5 days ago was so easily destroyed. Andreas, then walking towards her, claimed that she showed him something great. So, to thank her, he would show her something interesting as well. Diane could not understand what Andreas was saying and looked at him in confusion. Andreas, then holding the sword firmly, told Diane that, first of all, it is needed to surround the sword with aura. Then, after rearranging the aura's mana, a spell needs to be applied on it. Andreas, then holding his sword, which was covered with a black aura, pointed out that this was what she could do with it. Furthermore, one could cast a spell using aura instead of magic, which was his own magic that combines sword and magic.